I would like Thomas Sandel and Andrew Tucker to come up to the front for the next lecture. I'm not going to spend much time in introducing them. Just quickly saying Thomas Sandel is the founding director of the European Coalition for Israel. It's the only non-Jewish advocacy group for Israel active both in the EU in Brussels and in the UN in New York. Andrew, you all know, the CEO of Christians for Israel International, and also the legal counsel towards the ECI, and he's in the process putting up a think tank in The Hague on international law. Maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Thank you, Thomas and Andrew.
Now, Thomas and I are just going to share with you on this topic of the UN, the United Nations, and the European Union and Jerusalem. As most of you know, I'm working also with the European Coalition for Israel as an international lawyer. And I must say, it's been the most profoundly interesting work that I've been involved in. I'm very thankful to be able to work with Thomas on it. And I'm working on a book which I'm afraid you got on your chairs. It's a rather heavy thing. But I want to get rid of it, so they're on your chairs. You can decide whether you take them home or give them away or whatever. But I wanted to share it with you. It's a book we're writing. It's only a draft at this point. It's not for publication. But I'm giving it to you also, firstly, because I want to share some of the information that's in it, but also I'm inviting your feedback. It's written for non-lawyers. Hopefully it's something you can read. But the whole point of the book is to help you get a handle on what international law is. And I'm sure you're all similar to me, often at birthday parties or in a conversation with friends, or you read the newspaper and it says the settlements are illegal. Or as the Security Council said in December the 23rd, of 2016, they're a flagrant violation of international law. So what the UN is telling us that every Jewish man or woman, or for that matter, Israeli-Palestinian man or woman, who happens to live in East Jerusalem, or the old city of Jerusalem, is a flagrant violation of international law. Okay, so it's laying the foundation, as it were, for the removal of the Jewish people from the city of Jerusalem and from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. All I want to do, there's so much we could say. I don't want to get into too much detail now, but I want to just share with you a couple of thoughts about what international law is and why I think it's important for a number of reasons, and why I think you and I as Christians ought to be thinking about these issues. And I think we have to be able to answer the critics of Israel on this question. International law is important. In God's eyes, international law is important. In fact, in one way, the Bible is a story of international law. The Bible is the story, as it were, at least from the second book of the Bible, of the Jewish people and the nations. Willem mentioned it. You have the United Nations and you have Israel. The Bible is a story about nations, and I'm thankful for Harold Eckert, who's unfortunately not here at the moment, not feeling so well, but for his teaching on the nations, which to me has been a great revelation in recent years, that God loves the nations. He created the nations. He called the nations. The 70 nations are the descendants of the sons of Noah. He created the nations in their boundaries and in their languages. And of course, he dispersed the nations when they created the Tower of Babel. It was his judgment on the nations to disperse them in their different languages so that there would be confusion. Now, if there's anything we're seeing today, it's confusion in the United Nations as the world, again, the nations seek to create their new Tower of Babel. And it's a tower where there's no place for the Jewish people. There's no place for Israel. But God has a plan with the nations. We read in the book of Revelation, the final chapter of the Bible, that in that great kingdom where there's the river flowing and the tree of life on either sides of the river, the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And we've heard how the nations in the kingdom will go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, at least those nations which have been spared the judgment and the wrath of God. We understand from the Bible God will judge the nations for the way they have dealt with the Jewish people. Joel 2, Joel 3. He will judge the nations for dividing the land. God's wrath is on the nations. But there is a time of grace, there is a time of mercy, and we're in it right now when God is giving the nations a time to make a choice, final choices. Nations make choices, not only we as individuals, but we as nations make choices, and we're responsible to the Almighty for the choices that we make. That's why it's so important that we pray for our leaders. That's why it's so critically important we pray for our governments, because they are making the decisions of our nations, and they're making them in relation to Israel. And as Johannes said, it is Jerusalem that is the stumbling block of the nations. It is the issue of our generation, is the way that Jerusalem is being treated. And the last 6 months alone, less, have seen a manifestation of this, with the Security Council resolution in December, with the UNESCO decision only a couple of months earlier. These are all just one and more manifestations of something we've seen going on for decades. But it's reaching a new kind of a climax and an urgency and an intensity. And I think things are going to move very quickly at a certain point in time. Nations are sovereign. They not only have responsibility, but they are sovereign. It's one of the fundamental principles of the international legal order, is the sovereign equality of nations. And by writing this book, we're writing a story about the sovereign equality of nations. And Israel, in that sense, is a nation, but there's one thing that is being denied to it, and that is its freedom and its right to have sovereign equality amongst the nations. There's only one nation state, and Israel is a nation state under international law, only one that is discriminated against, only one that is constantly persecuted, constantly condemned. Every step that they make, if they move to the left or to the right, they are condemned. We don't do this with other nations, but for some reason we think we need to condemn Israel for everything they do wrong. I come from the country of Australia. You know, some people say there is the Jewish people, they've come to colonize the land and they're ethnically cleansing Palestine of the Palestinians. It's an apartheid state. It's a racist state. It's a state based on a fundamental inequality. Well, I come from Australia, where we and Great Britain actually ethnically cleansed the land of the Aboriginals. It's documented history. So if there's one nation that's founded on injustice, it's the nation state of Australia. But every nation, in one way or another, is based on an injustice and an unrighteousness. So who are we? How do we dare to condemn the Jewish people for the way they are treating the Palestinians? This last century is the history, as it were, of the way that the nations have been dealing with Israel. Isaiah 2 talks about this great vision that we have. When the Messiah comes, the word will go from Jerusalem, the law of the Lord, into the nations. And they will train for war no more. They will turn their spears into plowshares. And they will work. And there will be righteousness and justice on the earth. Those very words are written on the tablet outside the United Nations building in New York. So the nations are confronted every day as they go to make their decisions and formulate their resolutions in the United Nations with the word of the Almighty himself. There's only one thing they've misunderstood: the way the word of the Lord is going to go forth from Jerusalem. is not from the United Nations, but from the coming of the Messiah of Israel. From the Jerusalem that will be under the sovereignty of the Jewish people. That's why it's a stumbling block for the nations, because it's the very thing which is fundamentally frustrating the desires and the plans of the nations to create the kingdom of God on earth without God. That's the controversy of Zion. Let me just share a couple of things with you. Okay, so it just helps us a little bit to visualize. I'm not going to go too long, and then Thomas can share with us more how we're dealing with this. But let's orientate ourselves about Jerusalem, because this controversy, this discussion, this conflict is about a physical piece of territory. Jerusalem is on a particular piece of land. Where is Jerusalem here? This is the West Bank, what's known as the West Bank of the Jordan River. I remember growing up thinking the West Bank was kind of like the bank of a river. So it's some kind of sliver of land along the Jordan Valley. So it was very clever of the Jordanians when they occupied illegally the West Bank and Jerusalem in 1948, when they called it the West Bank of the Kingdom of Jordan, or Transjordan, which later became Jordan. They occupied it and claimed it to be part of the state of Jordan. That's why it's called the West Bank. But it is, as we can see here, these are the mountains of Judea and Samaria. Where did Abraham walk? Down through the mountains of Samaria to Jerusalem. Where is Hebron? Here is Bethlehem, Hebron. This is the mountains of God. This is Ezekiel 36. That God says, prophesy to the mountains. That's what we're talking about. And where is Jerusalem? I think the Lord has a sense of humor. He had to put Jerusalem somewhere. Well, where did he put it? Right in the middle of those mountains. There's no getting around Jerusalem. You can't just simply cut off the West Bank without somehow destroying Jerusalem. So at the end of the day, this is why the negotiations, the so-called peace negotiations between Israel and the PLO are going nowhere and will never go anywhere and will never result in a compromise or in a peace agreement. Because at the end of the day, the Jewish people will never give up sovereignty over the old city of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is another issue, but they will never give up their right to be close as possible to the temple of the Lord. That's Jerusalem. Here we are, where you want to see where these so-called settlements are, these illegal Jews. Well, they're living all the way throughout the West Bank. Here we are. This is what we've created in all our wisdom since 1993 in the Oslo agreements. You remember when Arafat shook the hands of Rabin on the White House lawns, for which they later received the Nobel Peace Prize by creating the Oslo agreements. Well, the Oslo agreements have resulted in this, and it is a complete mess, because these are the areas where the Palestinians have exclusive rights of governance, are the yellow areas. The brown areas are those areas where the governance is shared by the State of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And this blue area is Area C. This is the conflict area of Area C, where Israel has complete control, I won't say sovereignty, but control over these areas. And by the way, when the world talks about the Jewish people or Israel illegally building settlements, well, I can tell you the Palestinians are day by day illegally building their buildings throughout Area C as well, funded by the Palestinian Authority, who receives its money from you and me and our governments. The Palestinian Authority is almost 100% funded and financed by the Western world. It's not the Arab world which is supporting the Palestinian Authority. It's the Western world. And again, we have nothing against the Palestinians, but there is a generation of Palestinians standing up and who are saying, we don't want this anymore. We are sick of the corruption. We are sick of the UNRWA camps where our people, the Palestinian people, are held in prisons, as it were, with this promise that one day they will return to Jaffa and to Haifa and the places they were expelled from. They've been held through a lie in this captive situation in Lebanon and in Jordan and in the West Bank. They're sick and tired of the reality of the fact that Mahmoud Abbas earns over $1 million a year in his function as president of the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat died with billions of dollars in his Swiss bank account. And they're rising up, and I believe there is a generation of Palestinians who are prepared to stand up for the rights of the ordinary Palestinian people. And I think that Israel, the Jewish people, want the Palestinians to have some autonomy. They want respect and dignity. I spoke with a Palestinian leader recently, and he said the Palestinians don't want identity, they want dignity. That's what's being denied them, is dignity as human beings. And it's not Israel that's denying them that dignity. It's their own leadership and the leadership of the Arab world, and unfortunately the leaders of our nations who are allowing this situation to go on and on and on year after year. Jerusalem. This is the old city of Jerusalem. You know it all very well. This tiny little area here with the Temple Mount, Jewish, Armenian, Christian and Muslim quarters. And who knows what this line is? The Green Line, yeah. Very good. Thank you, Per. It's the Green Line. What is the Green Line? It's the border with Jordan. Problematic answer.
Before 67.
Before 67, yeah. Ceasefire. Thank you. These white dots here is actually the green line. This is indeed the armistice lines that ended the War of Independence, which started already in 1947. Interestingly, when did the War of Independence really... Of course, I think as Johannes has been telling us, there's been conflict in the area right through the British Mandate period and from even before. So that was not new, but there was a new wave, as it were, a new intensity of the struggle at the time that the Mandate was drawing to a close in 1947. And on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted to adopt the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan was an advice to the nations to create a Jewish and an Arab state in what remained of Palestine, Mandate Palestine, which is today all of the area of Israel plus the West Bank, plus Gaza and the Golan Heights, was to be created an Arab and a Jewish state. What happened? The Jewish people accepted the Partition Plan. The Arabs said no. That's their Nakba. Their Nakba is that the mandate for Palestine and Palestine allowed for the creation of a Jewish state. They were not so worried about the borders of the Arab state. They were saying the injustice, the Nakba, the tragedy, is the creation of a Jewish state. That's what they don't like. They're not too worried about these borders. They don't like the existence of the Jewish people as a nation in this region. So the war intensified, and on the 14th of May 1948, as the mandate finished on that very day, David Ben-Gurion stood up, you remember, in Tel Aviv, and declared the creation of the State of Israel on the evening of the 14th of May. The very next day, 5 Arab states attacked the new State of Israel. And that conflict ended when the armistice agreements were made in the course of 1949. And this was the armistice line agreement to stop the hostilities, end the war between Israel and Jordan, which had now occupied the West Bank. This is today the city of Jerusalem. These are the municipal boundaries of the city of Jerusalem when Israel took back Jerusalem and the West Bank in 1967, and very soon after declared the unification of the city of Jerusalem as the unified capital of the state of Israel. And these are the municipal boundaries as they have now developed. This is the old city here, and this is the green line which cuts through it. So the point to realize here is these are the boundaries which the world community, your nations and my nations, are deciding are to become the borders between Israel and a new Islamic state of Palestine. And it cuts through the very heart of Jerusalem. More than that, it cuts off the old city from the rest of Jerusalem. Here we have it again, the green line cutting through Jerusalem. Where is the Mount of Olives? It's on the eastern side of the green line. Where is the old Sendi? Where is the Temple Mount? It's on the eastern side of the green line. And time and again, the UN resolutions are passed in the General Assembly and now, unfortunately, in the Security Council as well, effectively saying that any Jewish people who are living in these areas are doing so illegally. It doesn't quite say that. It says Israel is acting illegally by creating or enabling the creation of these settlements. Okay, so not the individuals themselves who are illegal, but it's the state of Israel which is acting illegally. So we have today the UNESCO decision of October 2016, the UN resolution, and EU policy on Jerusalem. Let's just go back a moment in time to understand how we've got to the point of condemning the existence of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. So these were the mandates that were created after the First World War. The mandate of Mesopotamia, the mandate of Syria and Lebanon, and the mandate of Palestine here. These were amongst there were more mandates created at the end of the First World War. This was the end of the colonialism. Mandates were created as an alternative to colonialism. So when people say the Jewish people and the state of Israel and the mandate was a colonialist exercise, we say to them, no. The mandates were intended to give the peoples of these regions the right to self-determination. The whole point about the mandates was to give the peoples of the mandate areas the right to determine their own existence. Now, this Palestinian mandate was exceptional for one reason. It was intended to benefit the Jewish people particularly. The mandate for Palestine was intended to create the new or reconstituted national home of the Jewish people in Palestine. That was the Balfour Declaration, which found its way into the San Remo Resolution in 1920 and ultimately into the Mandate for Palestine, which was adopted by the League of Nations. So our nation states, especially of Europe and the West, which now are making the Israelis outlaws in this area, were the ones who in the very first place said the Jewish people have a right above all people to live in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. We have turned our backs upon the Jewish people. We gave them the opportunity, and now when the difficulties arise, we turn our backs upon them. This was Palestine. This was Palestine under the mandates. Look how big it was. It was Israel, it was the West Bank, and it was all of what is now the nation of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. In 1922, a decision was made under the mandate which allowed for this to happen, for the mandate area of Palestine to be divided in two, and the eastern side would be given to an Arab government to be administered by the Arabs, with the idea that on the western side of the Jordan River, this new nation state of the Jewish people would be created. So here is the beginning of the two-state solution. We could even say that there has been a two-state solution already. Most Jordanians are actually Palestinians. That's why Jordan is so worried about this idea of giving Palestinians now self-control and autonomy, because it threatens ultimately their own existence of the Hashemites as rulers of Jordan. You all know the history. We don't have time to go into it in detail, but I want to just share with you this very thought. When we as nations voted in 1922 in the context of the League of Nations to give the Jewish people the right to self-determination in Palestine, we called it a sacred trust of civilization. Article 22 of the League of Nations Charter. The whole point about this was, as a sacred trust, we were going to help the Jewish people to reconstitute their nation again in Palestine. And we are fundamentally going against the promises that we made at that time. The British did it under the mandate, but we are equally doing it, our nations, I believe, in the United Nations now. So I'm going to just rush through these. You'll see these are the various boundaries that have developed over the course of time. This was 1949. And then in 1967, miraculously, when in the Six-Day War, Israel fought back and not only defeated the invading armies of Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, but took control of the Sinai Desert, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. Okay, so these areas here are what are now called the occupied territories that Israel occupied apparently illegally. But as we've seen, apart from the Sinai, these were all areas that were part of the mandate for Palestine. This is the situation today. This is the area that's been claimed to be part of the new Palestinian state. Some people, over 130 states, say that the state of Palestine already exists. It's recognized, they say, as a state. You might ask the question, how have we got to the point whereby we are now voting in the United Nations, UNESCO, Security Council, General Assembly, and so forth? Something very important happened in 1973. It was the Yom Kippur War. This is the last attempt by the Arab states to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. And again, they failed. And they made a declaration that now they would turn from military force to destroy the state of Israel. They would use diplomatic and international pressure to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. So the League of Arab States, the Arab League, which was already created back in the, early 1950s. Tell me when the Arab League was, Johannes, do you know when it was created? After the Second World War anyway, and quite early on. Right, end of the 40s. It was the League of Arab States that created the PLO in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. And all the nations of the United Nations say that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. The charter of the PLO, the Palestinian Charter, which was revised in 1968, explicitly states that the purpose of the PLO is to destroy the Zionist occupation of Palestine. And what is Palestine? Palestine is all of Palestine. It says so in the Charter. All of Mandate Palestine. So to this very day, the PLO that Israel is being forced to negotiate with time and again, and I think they made the mistake of reaching an agreement with them in 1993, it's proved itself to be a disaster, is with the PLO, which remains dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. Let alone ISIS and Hamas and all the other forces which are now infiltrated into Gaza and to the West Bank. But what happened after 1973, October? We had the Arab oil boycott, and we had the beginning of a new European policy to support the creation of a state of Palestine on the so-called pre-1967 territories. November 1973, and this became known as what has been called the Euro-Arab Dialogue, which was the partnership between Europe, the 9 nations of the European Economic Community at the time in 1973. Great Britain had just joined, entered into a partnership with the Arab world. That partnership consisted of 2 sides. On the one side, Europe would accept the immigration of Arabs into Europe. This was the beginning of the great migration of Arabs into Europe. And in the Netherlands, for example, we have Moroccans, we have Turks, we have from many nations of the Arab world. They came in. We accepted not only to have them in, but also to promote Islamic studies in the schools and universities of Europe. This was a positive policy of the European Economic Community at the time. And it was all done under this Euro-Arab Dialogue. And each year there were meetings between the Arab League of Nations and other Islamic organisations and the heads of the European Commission and the organisations in Brussels to create this whole structure, which Batya Ora has called Eurabia. It's the Arabization of Europe. And we are now, I believe, seeing the fruits of that policy. But the other side, of course, Europe was to get access to the oil and gas of the Middle East. That was the benefit, and to be freed from Palestinian terrorism. That was the quid pro quo of Eurabia. And I believe everything we've seen since then has been built upon that foundation. I could go on to talk about the influence of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in the United Nations. The UN is just one great big pro-Palestinian institution. There's no pro-Israel institution within the UN, but there's a number, multiplied numbers of pro-Palestinian institutions within the UN, and they're all funded by the UN to create Palestinian statehood in recognition of the fundamental, inalienable right of the Palestinians to statehood based on the pre-67 lines. That's what the UN is all about. And in this book, we go into more detail about how that all works. It's called Delegitimization of Israel. It's about lawfare. It's about the misuse of international law, I believe, and the international institutions to condemn Israel and ultimately destroy the Jewish state of Israel. I'm going to hand over to you, Thomas. And Thomas is going to share a little bit more with us, and I hope you found that a little bit helpful. Thank you.